Hi everyone, welcome. So today I'm going to be talking about neurocontrol and how it relates to exercise. And so first up, I'm going to just briefly introduce the nervous system. I know we kind of already know this, but just going to break it down for you real quick. And so first up, we have our central nervous system. And so this consists of our brain and our spinal cord, and it's the higher processing area. Then we have our peripheral nervous system, which consists of the sensory and the motor nerves. And so our sensory nerves are afferent nerves, sense information either within our body or coming from outside of our body. And our motor and our efferent nerves is going to send information out to the organs, tissues, systems, etc. Our motor division can actually be split up into even more subdivisions. And so our first split is our autonomic versus our somatic nervous systems. And so our somatic nervous systems have to do more with voluntary contractions. And that's what we kind of think about in exercise is our voluntary movement. But exercise is also really important. And it has to do a lot with the autonomic system or our automatic functions. And so this is broken up into two other subdivisions. And we have our sympathetic nervous system, which has to do with fight or flight, and our parasympathetic system, which has to do with rest and digest. And so let's go and focus on the central nervous system. And so we have our brain and our spinal cord, and there's certain parts of our brain that I think are really important when it comes to exercise. So first up, we have our cerebrum, which is just this whole lobe. And that consists of our frontal, temporal, parietal, occipital, and insular lobe. So that's usually one we don't hear about, and it's actually underneath these, and it's more inside the brain. Part of their cerebrum that is really important when it comes to movement is our primary motor cortex. And so that's actually right in the back here. And it's control of fine and discrete muscle movement. So any kind of voluntary action we're doing, we're thinking about it, we're processing it in the frontal lobe, and it's all messages are being sent through the primary motor cortex. Next up, we have the diencephalon, and that's kind of this weird duck-shaped looking thing inside the brain. And within the diencephalon is our hypothalamus. And this is a big part of any sort of regulation for homeostasis. It helps with temperature regulation, fluid retention, hormones, right? All these important things that we need when we're exercising, the hypothalamus kind of controls it all. So it's super important. Next up, we have our cerebellum, which is this kind of weird gray stone looking thing at the base of our brain. And this helps with coordination of rapid and complex muscle activity. So a lot of balance, a lot of agility needs are satisfied through the cerebellum. And then we have our brainstem, which is made of our midbrain, pons, and the medulla oblongata right here. And this is more has to do with the automatic systems. And so this is the autonomic center for cardio and respiratory systems. Again, really important for exercise, but it's not stuff we have to consciously think about. And finally, we have our spinal cord, which consists of afferent and efferent nerve fibers that allow for two-way conduction from our body to our brain. So next up, we're going to talk about the peripheral nervous system. And so I'm going to get a little pointer going here. Just kidding. No, I'm not. Okay. Anyways, we're going to talk about our peripheral nervous system, and that's split up into two divisions, our sensory division and our motor division. And so again, sensory information is just coming in or from our body, and there's a couple of different receptors we use to do this. And so we have our mechanoreceptors, which sense mechanical force, such as touch, pressure, all those things. Thermoreceptors, which are activated by a change in temperature. We have nociceptors, which sense pain, painful stimuli. We have photoreceptors, which obviously are activated by changes in light. And then we have chemoreceptors, which sense chemicals, so more so like odors, toxins within our food, within the environment around us, or even with gases within our body. And then we have our motor division, which sends info to the organs, muscles, glands, everywhere. Okay, even more background information that I'm sure you guys all know. So we're going to go over what a neuron is and an action and how it kind of fires, right? And so neurons are the most important things in our body. They're sending information everywhere. And so to break it up, we have our dendrites, which are these little spindly finger-looking things on the top. And those are what's going to receive the information. And information is going to come into the cell body and kind of be processed. And then it's going to travel down the axon, which is this long part here. Sometimes axons are covered by a myelin sheath, and that just helps with conduction, and it speeds up the signal. And then finally, the signal will be released through axon terminals, in a sense that axon terminals contain vesicles, which contain neurotransmitters, and those neurotransmitters will leave the axon terminal and help distribute the signal. Sorry, I don't know how to use words today. Okay, and so how does this happen? So usually neurons are at rest, and then some other neuron will send a signal, and it'll be picked up by the dendrites, and this is going to increase the membrane potential. So it's going to go from a resting membrane potential of -70 to threshold potential, and that's at -50, -55 millivolts. As soon as it hits that threshold, sodium channels and potassium channels are going to open. Sodium is going to flood in, potassium is going to flood out, and that's going to cause a positive membrane potential, and that's what we call a depolarization. Then eventually the stimulus is going to stop, and our sodium and our potassium channels are going to close. And then so it's going to come and it's going to repolarize and become more negative. Sometimes the potassium channels are a little slow to close, and so potassium will keep leaking out of the cell, making it more negative. And so it's actually going to go past resting, and it's going to become even more negative, so around -80, and that's called a hyperpolarization. But eventually those channels will close and we'll come back to our resting membrane potential. And this happens over and over and over and over in order to get anything to happen in our body. And so when it comes specifically to our muscle and our skeletal muscle, we talk about motor units. And so that is our alpha motor neuron, so this guy right here. And it's attached to all the muscle fibers it innervates, right? And there is a small space between these connections, which I'll go over in a little bit, but it's where communication occurs. And so our main pathway is going to be an action potential is propagated through the alpha motor neuron, and this is an electrical signal. It's going to release some neurotransmitters from its axon terminals, and it's going to travel through the neuromuscular junction, and so this is our chemical signal. It's going to bind on these receptors to the muscle fiber, and they're either going to be inhibitory or they're going to be excitatory, and so it's going to be an EPSP or an IPSP. And if it's inhibitory, it's going to cause a hyperpolarization, so the cell is going to become more negative. But if it's excitatory, it's going to cause a depolarization, and the muscle cell is going to be more positive, and it's going to cause an action potential within the muscle fiber. And so important neurotransmitters that we talk about in exercise are acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So acetylcholine, it has excitatory effects on skeletal muscle. So when it binds to those receptors, it causes a positive influx of sodium, and that's going to cause muscle contraction. But it can also have an inhibitory effect when it binds to receptors on the heart. So it does both in different places. And the same thing goes for norepinephrine. It has both excitatory and inhibitory effects in sympathetic neurons, depending on where it is and what functions are needed. So this is as simple as it gets. We have a stimulus, a receptor senses it, it gets sent through the sensory neuron, and then our brain processes it. It goes through a motor neuron, and it tells us what to do. And so we kind of skip over this in exercise. I feel like we hop straight to hypertrophy because it's super cool and it's visible and we know the effects of hypertrophy, but we all know that neural adaptations come first. And so what are these adaptations? Well, the first one that happens is there's an increase in motor unit activity, specifically when you're learning a new skill. So when you're learning a new movement, it's going to light up that primary motor cortex we were talking about. And it's going to cause neural changes. So either in the spinal cord, or it's going to connect more neurons to just send information more efficiently. That brings us to motor units. So all three of these things are going to cause an increase in force production. So an increase in recruitment, as in the increase of recruitment of additional motor units. So the more motor units that are firing, the more contraction that we can have, the more force we can produce. Same thing goes for synchronization, right? When you're first learning a skill, you're all kind of like wobbly doing your bench press, but as your body gets more used to sending these signals and sending them in synchronization, our movement becomes a lot smoother. And finally, we have an increase in firing rate or frequency. And so on the bottom, it says an increase in firing rate is going to cause a summation of overlapping action potentials, which is going to cause an increase in force production. Some more neural adaptations. The slide's kind of crazy. So the next thing is our neuromuscular junction, which we talked about previously, and so that's right over here. If there's going to be some structural changes to the neuromuscular junction, that's really going to enhance, the amount of information that can be sent and received. And so the first one is just an overall increase in the area of the neuromuscular junction. We'll go over that. So there's a greater total length of the axon terminal branching. And so this is our axon terminal here. And this doesn't do a great job of depicting it, but this will actually come and dig into the muscle fiber over here. And so when we have this adaptation, it's going to get larger and it's going to have deeper fissions into our membrane. Oops, sorry. And then we have an increase in our motor end plate area. So this right here is our motor end plate. It's where all of our receptors are. Obviously, as this grows, we have more receptors, we have more of ability, and we increase the probability of this receptors binding to, these neurotransmitters binding to their receptors. Oh gosh, I can't talk. Okay, and then finally, we have a greater dispersion. This says acetylcholine receptors on the motor end plate, and this is specifically for skeletal muscle fibers. So these little pink guys right here, there's just going to be more of them. Again, increasing the probability that a neurotransmitter is going to bind to its receptor, which obviously is going to increase the neural response. And finally, we have a change in our neuromuscular reflex potentiation. All that really has to do with is the stretch shortening cycle. And so we're going to enhance the amount of passive energy we can retain either from our skeletal muscle, the connective tissue of our skeletal muscle or our tendons. And so that's going to just increase our force production without using any additional energy. So there's a lot of research on neuromuscular adaptations, and I thought because we had such an interesting discussion in class about how there's little research done on women, I tried to pull one on resistance training in women. And so this study took 10 young females and 10 old females, and they put them through 14 days, 4 sets of 10 at 70% of their 1RM of a bicep curl. And so they measured a couple of things, and they found that after these 14 days, so a very acute amount of time, not a very long amount of training, they actually already found an increase in strength by 28%. There's a decrease in efficiency of electrical activity. So that just meant they got more efficient with the amount of activation they were sending. But they found no change in cross-sectional area, and there was no difference between the ages. So the main takeaway of this was there can still be improvements in strength by up to 28% from only neural adaptations, which we saw by the change in efficiency of electrical activity, even if there is no hypertrophy done. So they didn't increase their cross-sectional area, means they did not have any sort of hypertrophy, but they were still able to increase their strength. Another important takeaway is that there's actually no difference, in this study at least, between young and old females. They were thinking that older females wouldn't really have the same sort of adaptations as younger females, partly due because of the neural activation, but it looks like there is no difference between the two. So keep resistance training until you are 80. Hopefully we live that long. Okay, oh my gosh. Okay, so effects of detraining, again, and something we don't really think about in exercise science because we're constantly telling people, go train, make sure you're doing your stuff, make sure you're staying active. But in cases like what we're in right now, that's not always possible. And sometimes you get hurt and sometimes you get quarantined and sometimes you gotta detrain, which is where we are at right now. So Gondon in 2006 looked at the neural and muscular changes to detraining after electrostimulation training. And so they had 17 males overall, but part of them were in the control group. So they had 9 recreationally active males participate in the exercise program, and they had them do 8 weeks of training and then 4 weeks of detraining. So after training, they found that there was an increase in maximal voluntary contraction torque. So just an increase in torque pretty much. An increase in the vastus lateralis and medialis muscle activation, and an increase in quadricep cross-sectional activation. After the 4 weeks of detraining, they found a decrease in all the above. However, the quadriceps cross-sectional area, even though it decreased, it still stayed higher than what they originally started with in before they started training. So it stayed higher than baseline levels, but anything that had to do with like neural activation decreased right back to baseline. So the muscle activation and the torque values. And so the main takeaway was that losses in torque had to do with both neural and muscular adaptations, but hypertrophy gains were lost slower. So it looks like we get our neural activation adaptations first, and then we lose them first. So that sucks. Another study on detraining, they looked at 13 sedentary males, so people who had never worked out before, and they put them through 3 months of heavy resistance training and then 3 months of detraining, which sucks. And so after training, again, they found that there's an increase in force, and that had to do with an increase in muscle activation. And there was also an increase in muscle cross-sectional area by 10%. Then they had them detrain for the same amount of time, and they found that they actually preserved their muscle strength and their muscle activation only during eccentric actions, which is interesting. So they measured eccentric and concentric actions. And so the main takeaway of this is that heavy resistance training can induce long-lasting strength gains and neural adaptations, but really only for max eccentric contractions. So hopefully you guys were getting your lifts in before we went in quarantine, and then we'll all be good for eccentric contractions and we'll come back. So, moral of the story is that we are all currently going through some detraining. We are probably losing our neural adaptations as we speak, but that's okay. When we come back, we're actually going to be able to see the gains again. We're not going to be stuck at our plateau. We're going to get those neural adaptations, and we're going to see our increase in strength go up like crazy. So stay safe, guys. Stay sane, and good luck on the rest of your finals. Hopefully see you all in the fall. Bye, guys.